Well, it's illegal to possess cannabis, to grow it, to supply it, or to import it. It's called a controlled drug, but it's not controlled at all. I mean, it's exactly the opposite. In fact, it's completely uncontrolled because the government, through this form of regulation, has abandoned any control of it to a criminal market. So, you know, what we have now is £6 billion being spent every year on a product for which there is no regulation and no control. There are, we know, somewhere between 2 million and 6 million regular users of cannabis in Britain. Now again, what do we mean by regular? The data that I rely on are those produced by the Independent Drug Monitoring Unit back in 2011 when we commissioned a study from them. And they say there's about 3 million regular users of cannabis, which means people who use cannabis at least once a month. Now, in my experience, and I've got a lot of it now, in my experience talking to people who use cannabis, I would estimate that something between 25% and a third of people who use cannabis would claim to use it for some sort of medicinal reason. So what I would say that means is there are somewhere approaching 1 million medicinal cannabis users, certainly hundreds of thousands. I have no doubt there are hundreds of thousands, and I think it could be as high as 1 million. Yeah. And I mean, it's undoubtedly true that the latest evidence shows that cannabis it can almost be regarded as a nutritional supplement, in that it's supplementing the endocannabinoid system and helping to protect us against the sort of autoimmune diseases like diabetes and cancer, and in older people, you know, against the onset of dementia, and you know, these things are all supported by good, solid scientific evidence now. Well, if you look at the sort of surveys that have been done, typically, I mean, there was one just recently commissioned by Transform, which shows that 53% of people want to see cannabis legally regulated or decriminalised in some way or another. But I think the interesting point about all these surveys is that it's a very soft position. In other words, whilst people are prepared to give that as an answer, they're prepared to support the idea in principle. If you were then to throw into the mix the fact that the Daily Mail is going to come along and run a big scare campaign, people are going to be very ready to change their opinions quite quickly. So whilst if you ask people in an unbiased or in a non-biased environment what their view is, they may support the idea. As soon as any outside influence comes in or tries to push them in the other direction, they're very quick to change their mind. I think the truth of the matter is there's been no progress towards legalisation. You know, the Misuse of Drugs Act came in 1971. Until 1971, from the medicinal point of view, you could still go into a chemist or a pharmacist and you could buy a tincture of cannabis. A doctor could prescribe it to you. But all that stopped in 1971. Now, since then, the campaign has gotten nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. My view of that is that the campaign's very much shot itself in the foot. And the methods it's used to try and move towards legalisation have actually worked in exactly the opposite direction. And that's very much what I've tried to do since I was elected as leader of CLEAR. I've tried to take the campaign in a different direction and to speak to a wider, broader audience than simply the users of cannabis. Because, as I say, I think the methods and tactics that have been used, marching in the streets, demos, etc., have been proven not to work. And in fact, I think they've given politicians and leaders the excuse they need not to do anything about it. We need to be operating on a much more considered, much more intelligent, and much more respectful basis. You know, standing in front of a policeman, smoking a joint and blowing smoke on his face doesn't work. You have to recognise that cannabis has been used for at least 5,000 years that we know of. You know, I think the oldest discovery was somewhere in Central Asia, dated to about 2700 BC, where psychoactive cannabis was found in a tomb. So we know that mankind has been using it for medicinal, spiritual, recreational reasons for at least that long. It's only 30 years ago, or 1988, that we actually see some scientific evidence coming out to support the reasons why. And that is the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. And we now know that not just humans, but all mammals, all birds, all fish, all reptiles have an endocannabinoid system. And this is a system that regulates your cardiovascular system, your gastrointestinal system, your immune system, your central nervous system. Virtually every physiological process in the body is actually regulated by the endocannabinoid system. And what that means is that it is a network of receptors and of microscopic amounts of chemicals called cannabinoids, called endocannabinoids, which affect the way our body works. And what cannabis does is it modulates that system. So in the same way as a lot of things in medicine, it can work both ways. So for instance, the popular idea, the popular myth is that cannabis can cause mental health problems. But in practice, many people who have mental health problems use cannabis to medicate them. So, even Sativex, the one legal form of cannabis produced by GW Pharmaceuticals, what they actually call Sativex is an endocannabinoid system modulator. And that's what cannabis does. It affects the way the endocannabinoid system works. So, and it can be in many, many ways. Pain, memory, taste, vision, all these things can be affected by cannabis. And they can have a negative effect or a positive effect. The whole Sativex issue is a scandal. It's a complete scandal. I mean, I don't blame GW Pharmaceuticals for it. I mean, in fact, on the contrary, I congratulate GW Pharmaceuticals for it. But I mean, what they've done is they've taken advantage of a completely incompetent and corrupt government regulatory system. I think the way that they probably achieved it in the first place was to persuade the government, or persuade the licensing authority, the MHRA, persuade them that what Sativex wasn't in fact cannabis. That in fact what it is an extract of just two components of cannabis, THC and CBD. But that's not true. Simply not true. And even Jeffrey Guy, the chairman of GW Pharmaceuticals, now acknowledges this. This was a white lie, if you like, which they tried to sustain for a while, but just simply doesn't stand up to investigation. Jeffrey Guy himself says that Sativex is the first medicine derived from a plant which contains something in excess of 400 different compounds. So the fact that we can have a situation where Sativex can be legal but cannabis can't is completely nonsensical. There's no basis in science, in logic, or anything. And the net result is that what we have is a situation where GW Pharmaceuticals has been granted a monopoly that must be unlawful, based on a completely false premise. And it went even further earlier this year when the Home Secretary retrospectively legalised the work that GW Pharmaceuticals has been doing for the last 10 years, because the Home Secretary only ever had power to grant a license to grow cannabis for research purposes. And fair enough, that was given to GW Pharmaceuticals in 1998. But in 2003, GW Pharmaceuticals entered into a commercial agreement with Bayer, the giant pharmaceutical company. And from that moment on, it became a commercial enterprise. And so from that moment on, GW Pharmaceuticals was operating outside the law and outside the remit of its license. Extraordinarily, March 2013, the Home Secretary retrospectively legalises that. It's outrageous. Okay, well, Clear was formerly known as the Legalised Cannabis Alliance. And the Legalised Cannabis Alliance was formed in 1999. It grew out of previous legalisation initiatives. And it had really fallen into the doldrums, as the whole campaign had. You remember that cannabis was downgraded from Class B to Class C in 2003, and then re-upgraded again in 2009, in the early days of 2009. Now really, this knocked the whole campaign in Britain for six, because I think people became complacent. So they thought we were going in the right direction and that everything would be okay. But in fact, there was a terrible backlash, driven principally by the man who's really in charge of drugs policy in this country, who's Paul Dacre, the chief editor of the Daily Mail. There was a backlash. So in 2010, I became more and more interested in the cannabis campaign. I'd worked on it sporadically for many years, written articles and things. But in 2010 I become much more interested in it as I became familiar with the latest evidence supporting medicinal use. And it was suggested to me that what the campaign really needed in this country was some leadership. And so I went to the Legalised Cannabis Alliance to find out what was going on. And sadly I found out that nothing was going on. And quite quickly thereafter I found myself invited onto the committee. We decided to re-register as a political party, and quite quickly thereafter I found myself elected leader. Now I'm from an advertising and marketing background, and it was crystal clear to me that the communication of the messages about cannabis needed to be radically updated and overhauled, and the whole image of the campaign, the whole way that the campaign is presented, needed to change radically. And so working with my colleagues on the committee and with the membership, which at that time was tiny, embarrassingly small, we put together a proposal to rename ourselves as Cannabis Law Reform, or CLEAR for short. And that was put to the membership by a ballot, and it was approved. At the same time we changed the constitution, we refined our objectives. Instead of having like a sort of 10-page document or something, we came up with 5 short objectives. The most important one is the first one, which is simply to end the prohibition of cannabis, but most urgently for people who need it as medicine. So in the last 3 years, we've developed a new corporate identity, we've developed a presence on Facebook, we've developed a new website, and we've developed a series of tactics which have developed over time. And the methods of the past were not working. 40 years since the Misuse of Drugs Act, no progress being made whatsoever. In fact, if anything, we've gone backwards. And what's quite clear is that instead of marching in the streets, instead of holding banners saying free the weed or legalise cannabis, what we need to be doing is engaging with government. It's putting across arguments methodically, supporting them with scientific evidence, behaving as responsible people, so that it's not about going and getting off your head, and well, there's nothing the matter with that. People do it in bars up and down the country. But when you want to achieve change, you can't do it by displaying that sort of behaviour. And so we've become very much more focused on the medicinal angle, because I do believe that's what matters most of all, and I do believe that's the way to break down prejudices and break down barriers. When people see the almost miraculous effects that cannabis can have on some people who need it as medicine, then I think it'll help to dispel some of the fear there is around the subject, because cannabis is a remarkably benign substance. One of the great things about it, particularly in the medicinal context, is that even if it doesn't work for you, even if it doesn't achieve what you want to achieve, it's not going to do you any harm. Okay, well, George Hutchings is a member of CLEAR. I don't remember how he first got in touch with me, but I mean, he certainly contacted me in the first place, I think, to ask some advice or to find out what the latest developments were. And also he'd been in touch with his MP. And his MP, who's a true blue Tory in every sense, and perhaps not the first person you would imagine would be supportive of this, had asked some questions in Parliament about medicinal cannabis. And very quickly we managed to put the 3 of us together, if you like. And Andrew Turner has become a real stalwart supporter of the work we're trying to do, and a real stalwart supporter of George, because George suffers from a terrible degenerative disease, for which cannabis is really, frankly, the only effective. It's not a remedy, really, it's a therapy, because anything else that the doctor might prescribe to him is going to have terrible side effects and terrible, perhaps long-term consequences on his liver and other parts of his body. Whereas cannabis is, as I say, generally benign. It relieves any pain, it relieves any spasms that he suffers from, and it's the ideal solution to his problem. What we've been trying to do, what we've been trying to do is develop methods of engaging with the authorities and engaging with the government, pushing the law to its limits, trying to find loopholes, find ways around it so that people can operate legally. You know, nobody wants to break the law, particularly not if they're using cannabis for medicine. So quite early on, we looked at the possibility of, you know, if GW Pharmaceuticals can get a license to grow cannabis, why can't somebody else? And in fact, we've applied in various ways for licenses to cultivate cannabis, and without exception, they're refused. You know, I think perhaps if GlaxoSmithKline or you know, one of the other big pharmaceutical companies came along and applied, they might get treated differently. But if you go to the government or to the Home Office specifically and suggest that you're a small startup operation that wants to look at producing a medical product made out of cannabis, they're not interested. They just brush you aside. So in effect, you know, GW does have a monopoly. So we've also looked at the possibility of obtaining cannabis which is available abroad and bringing it into this country. And everybody tells us that it can't be done. 3 years ago, 4 years ago perhaps, there was a belief that the Schengen agreements, part of the EU, would protect people. In other words, if they went to Europe and obtained a prescription for cannabis in a country where it is commonly prescribed, that the Schengen agreements will protect them bringing it back to this country. And indeed the Home Office told people that that was correct. But very quickly that unravelled. And it became clear the Schengen agreement offers no protection for British residents, because it's all about residency. If you live in Britain, it doesn't matter what nationality you are, if you live in Britain, then the Schengen agreement will not protect you from bringing medicinal cannabis in. So we continue to look at ways of doing it. I heard on the great, you've got to understand a lot of these things are not spoken about. So obviously if people find successful methods, they tend to keep it to themselves because they don't want to lose their supply. But we looked again at the possibility of obtaining an import license. And we've applied for import licenses in the name of various CLEAR members, and eventually they've been refused. And we developed the idea of obtaining a refusal, maybe to a number of applications, and then taking the whole subject to judicial review. And that is still our plan. So the process we've developed, as I say, is obtain the prescription from a UK doctor, apply to the Home Office for an import license, pretty confident in the knowledge you're going to be refused. Thirdly, make contact with a pharmacy in Holland and tell them you've got a prescription and are they prepared to fulfill it. And fourthly, to go to Holland, pick up the prescription, bring it back, and most important of all, declare it openly at customs. Tell them what you've got, tell them that it's medicine, tell them here's the prescription, and take it from there. And 5 people have done it so far, and all 5 of them have been allowed through.
Oh, even 5? I thought there's only 1.
No, 5 people so far have done it. In fact, 5 people have been on 6 occasions. Because the first person who went, Jamie, who we originally called Clarence Clear, but has now revealed his identity as Jamie Watlin, went for a repeat prescription just a couple of weeks ago.
So everyone got through, just 5?
Everybody's got through. So there have been 6 trips, 5 people. And as you know, George is going this week.
Seems to be working.
Yeah. I mean, it may be, it may, as some people have said, it may simply be that border agency staff are turning a blind eye, and that may well be true. I'm not saying I'm doing nothing else except simply presenting the facts to you. This is what we've done, this is what's happened, and we will continue to do it. We will continue to press the Home Office through MPs and directly, tell them what's going on, and say, surely, what needs to be done is this needs to be regularised in a way where everybody knows what they're doing, and where very sick and unwell people don't have to go through all the hassle of travelling to Holland and coming back and all the expense as well, where they could be doing it by post. You know, that's all we need to do. This is not opening the door to a massive flood of, you know, dangerous drugs coming into the country, which is how some people would like to portray it. It's about humane, merciful treatments of people with terrible conditions. We've had 2 import license refusals. The Home Office doesn't want to refuse the import license because it knows that as soon as it refuses the license, then it opens itself up to judicial review. I can never say that. It opens itself up to judicial review. But we now have had 2 refusals. The first refusal was Jamie. But Jamie, quite understandably, now that he's found a safe and regular method of obtaining his medicine doesn't really want to go through the whole process of judicial review. George, on the other hand, George is a fighter, George is a warrior, and George is very keen to take the process the whole way through. And we're now in touch with probably the most well-known team of barrister and solicitor in cannabis cases who will be taking this forward for us. Well, I can't tell you it firsthand because I haven't done it myself. I say unfortunately, that's not right at all. I mean, fortunately, I don't have a medical need for cannabis. But I mean, as I understand it, it's simply a matter. I mean, I've been through the red channel at customs in the past, and it's simply, yeah, you go through the red channel, and you simply walk up to somebody and say, "I have some medicine which I've obtained in Holland that I want to declare. Here's my prescription, and here's the medicine." Now, I'm told from the people who've reported back to me that they've been treated very courteously. The medicine has been examined in detail, usually not by just one officer, but by 2 or 3. And they've checked the paperwork, and quite quickly, without a lot of fuss, they've been waved through. In fact, on the first occasion that Jamie went, I know that they were surprised. They complimented him on being upfront and direct about it, and they also took copies of all his documents and said to him, "Well, next time you come through, it'll be much quicker."
So, what documents are those? If you refuse an import license, do you show the letters still?
Yeah, that's what Jamie did. Well, you see, first, I mean, it's quite a convoluted subject, and this is not an easy process. You know, I'm not pretending in any way it's easy, but I mean, under the personal import license scheme, you're not supposed to need a personal import license if you're obtaining less than 3 months' supply. So George had, Jamie, on behalf of Jamie, had an email back from the Home Office saying, as you're going for less than 3 months' supply, no import license is required. So that was a useful email for Jamie to be able to show them as well. You know, this is not cut and dried. You know, I'm not claiming, and I've never claimed, that we've found a complete solution to this. I'm simply, as I said, laying out the facts of what we've done and what has happened. Well, I believe the worst case scenario is he could have his medicine confiscated. But I mean, I don't believe anything else could happen, because up until the point where he arrives at customs, everything is legal. It's been legally prescribed, it's been legally dispensed, and he's done the right thing and declare it coming into the country. So at that point, if they say to him, well, he can't bring it in and we're confiscating it, fair enough. But I don't see that he could be liable for any sort of prosecution. And we have taken legal advice on this, of course, you know. Well, it is a PR stunt, of course it is. That's the business that we're in. We're in the business of bringing this to the attention of the public and the government in order to secure change. And the brave people involved who've agreed to allow their case to be publicised are the real heroes in this. But I mean, that's exactly, we do want publicity from it, of course we do. I honestly believe that we are quite close to having some sort of medicinal use permitted. And I think that's in large part has come about because of the Sativex situation, because the Sativex deception is unsustainable. And we will bring the whole question to court. We will bring it to court within the near future. And hopefully, before we get that far, the Home Office, particularly under the auspices of the new Drugs Minister, Norman Baker, who's a Lib Dem, and therefore has rather more balanced view on the situation than the extreme right-wing Tories, hopefully they'll take the decision to do the sensible thing and simply say, if your doctor has prescribed medicinal cannabis to you and you need to go to Holland to get it, then yes, you can have an import license to bring it in. I mean, what possible reason could they have for refusing it?